Greenwood High School was nestled in the heart of a small town called Willow Creek. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where life moved at a slower pace, and where the biggest news of the week was usually about a new shop opening or the local football team winning a game. It was a tight-knit community, the kind where parents felt safe letting their children walk to school and neighbors looked out for each other. Crime was almost non-existent, and the most serious incidents that the local police dealt with were usually minor traffic violations or the occasional case of vandalism. The school itself was a large, red brick building that had stood for over 50 years. It was the only high school in the town, and generations of families had passed through its halls. The classrooms were filled with old wooden desks, and the walls were adorned with pictures of past graduating classes and trophies won by various sports teams. It was a place of tradition, where teachers had taught the children of students they'd had decades before, and where the idea of something bad happening seemed almost impossible. But that illusion of safety was shattered one cold, gray afternoon in November. My name is Miller. I'm 17 years old, a senior at Greenwood High, and like most teenagers, I was counting down the days until graduation. School was never really my thing. I wasn't a star athlete or an academic overachiever. I was just a regular student, getting by with decent grades and trying to navigate the complicated social landscape of high school. My best friends, Jenny and Marcus, were my lifelines. They made the long, tedious school days bearable. Jenny was the outgoing one, always full of energy and ideas, while Marcus was the quiet, thoughtful type who always had a book in his hand. The three of us had been inseparable since middle school, and we spent most of our time together, either at school or hanging out at the local diner after classes. We all came from similar backgrounds. Our parents worked regular jobs, and we lived in modest houses on tree-lined streets. Life was predictable, routine, and safe. But that sense of security was something I took for granted. It wasn't until that fateful day that I realized how fragile it all was, how quickly everything could change. It was just a regular Monday. The sky was overcast, and there was a chill in the air that hinted at the coming winter. The morning had passed without incident, and I was in my 5th period English class, half listening to Mrs. Thompson drone on about Shakespeare when the announcement came over the intercom. At first it was just static, a crackle that made everyone look up in confusion. Then, the voice of Principal Reynolds came on, and something in his tone immediately set me on edge. Attention, students and staff. This is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown. Please follow the lockdown procedures immediately. There was a moment of stunned silence in the classroom, a beat of time where no one moved, no one spoke. We'd had lockdown drills before, but they were always just that. There was something different about this one, something in the way Principal Reynolds spoke that made it clear this was no drill. Mrs. Thompson was the first to react. "Everyone, get away from the windows and move to the back of the room," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Quickly now." The class sprang into action, the air suddenly thick with fear. We scrambled to the back of the room, where Mrs. Thompson had us crouched down behind her desk. She turned off the lights and locked the door, then drew the blinds on the windows, plunging the room into an eerie semi-darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crouched there, squeezed between Jenny and Marcus, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could feel Jenny trembling next to me, and Marcus's hand brushed against mine, his touch cold and clammy. No one spoke, but the tension in the room was palpable, the fear so thick you could almost taste it. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it, the sound of gunfire. It was faint, muffled by the walls of the school, but unmistakable. The sound sent a jolt of terror through me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Someone was in the school, someone with a gun. The minutes that followed felt like hours. We huddled together in the dark, listening, waiting, the silence broken only by the occasional distant sound of footsteps or a door slamming somewhere in the school. Every noise made me jump, my heart racing, my mind filled with images of what might be happening just beyond the walls of our classroom. I kept thinking about my family, about my little brother who was in the middle school, just a few miles away, and my parents who were at work, completely unaware of what was happening. I wanted to reach out to them, to tell them I was okay, but my phone was in my backpack, and I didn't dare move to get it. The fear was paralyzing, a cold, suffocating weight on my chest. I wasn't the only one feeling it. Jenny was shaking uncontrollably, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Marcus was trying to keep calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes too, the way his hands clenched into fists as if he could will the danger away. Mrs. Thompson was doing her best to keep us calm, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, that help was on the way. But even she couldn't hide the fear in her voice, the way her hands trembled as she held her phone, waiting for any news from the office. Then, suddenly there was a sound outside the door, a soft, almost hesitant knock. We all froze, our breath catching in our throats. Mrs. Thompson held up a hand, signaling for us to stay quiet. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of a voice, low and urgent. "Mrs. Thompson? It's Officer Daniels. We're clearing the building. Are you and the students okay?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated for just a moment before moving to the door. She opened it just a crack, enough to see the officer standing on the other side, his gun drawn, his face set in a grim expression. "It's safe now," he said, his voice low and steady. "We've secured the intruder. We're moving everyone to the gymnasium." The relief that flooded through me was almost overwhelming. We were safe. The nightmare was over. But even as we filed out of the classroom, sticking close to Mrs. Thompson, I couldn't shake the fear that clung to me, the feeling that something was still terribly wrong. The gymnasium was filled with students and teachers, all of them huddled together in groups, some crying, others staring blankly ahead, still in shock. The air was thick with tension, the fear still palpable, even though the immediate danger had passed. We were told to stay there until the police finished their sweep of the school. Parents were being notified, and we would be released as soon as it was safe to do so, but no one was in a hurry to leave the gym. The sense of safety that had once been taken for granted was gone, replaced by a raw, gnawing fear that had seeped into the very walls of the school. I found myself clinging to Jenny and Marcus, the three of us sitting on the bleachers, too stunned to talk. The reality of what had happened was starting to sink in, the shock giving way to a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. As the hours passed, details of what had happened began to emerge. The intruder was a former student, someone who had graduated a few years before. He had been troubled, struggling with mental health issues that had gone unnoticed by most. He had come back to the school that day armed with a gun, intending to take revenge on those he felt had wronged him. Thankfully, no one had been seriously hurt. The police had responded quickly, and the situation had been contained before it could escalate further. But the damage had been done. The sense of safety and security that had once defined our school, our community, had been shattered. The fear that had gripped us all during those long, terrifying minutes would linger for a long time. For me, the experience changed everything. I couldn't walk through the halls of Greenwood High without feeling a surge of anxiety, without hearing the echoes of that distant gunfire in my mind. I couldn't sit in a classroom without constantly glancing at the door, waiting for something to happen. The fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, a constant reminder of how fragile our lives really were. And it wasn't just me. The entire school, the entire community was changed. The easygoing, carefree atmosphere that had once defined Willow Creek was gone, replaced by a sense of unease, a collective anxiety that touched everyone. The lockdown drills that had once been treated as a formality were now taken with deadly seriousness. The security measures at the school were tightened, and counselors were brought in to help students and staff cope with the trauma. But some wounds couldn't be healed. Some scars would never fade. The fear that had taken root in my heart that day was something I would carry with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the fragility of the world we live in. And that is a fear that I don't think I will ever truly escape. My name is Mrs. Carter, and I've been a teacher for almost 15 years. I've spent my entire career at Westbrook Middle School, a small, aging building in a quiet suburb on the outskirts of the city. Teaching was never just a job for me, it was a calling. I knew from a young age that I wanted to work with kids, to help shape their minds and give them the tools they needed to navigate the world. Over the years, I've seen hundreds of students pass through my classroom, each with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. I was in my late 30s, single and entirely dedicated to my job. My friends often joked that I was married to my work, and in many ways they weren't wrong. I poured everything I had into my students, spending long hours at the school and even more at home, grading papers and planning lessons. It wasn't uncommon for me to stay late after school, tutoring students who needed extra help or organizing after-school activities. I was the teacher who knew every student's name, their strengths, their weaknesses, and often what was going on in their lives outside of school. Westbrook was a good school, with dedicated staff and mostly well-behaved students. The community was close-knit, with many of the families having lived in the area for generations. The biggest issues we dealt with were the occasional bullying incidents or the rare fights between students. Serious trouble was almost unheard of, and the thought of real danger in our school seemed unimaginable. But that was before everything changed. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon in late November, the kind of day where the sky is overcast and the air carries a biting cold. The day had started like any other, with me arriving at the school early to prepare for my classes. The students were restless, eager for the upcoming Thanksgiving break, and I was focused on keeping them engaged, trying to channel their energy into something productive. The school day was winding down, and my sixth period English class was busy working on an in-class essay. The room was filled with the sound of pencil scratching against paper, the occasional sigh, and the rustle of pages being turned. I was seated at my desk, grading papers from my earlier classes, when the phone on the wall behind me rang. The sound startled me. It was unusual for the phone to ring during class, and I immediately felt a twinge of anxiety. I set down my red pen and picked up the receiver. "Mrs. Carter," I answered, my voice calm, but with a slight edge of concern. There was a brief pause on the other end before a voice I didn't recognize spoke. "Is this the English teacher?" The voice was male, low, and strangely devoid of emotion. "Yes, this is Mrs. Carter," I replied, feeling a knot of unease forming in my stomach. "How can I help you?" There was another pause, longer this time. I could hear faint breathing on the other end, and it sent a chill down my spine. "I want you to listen very carefully," the voice said, still calm, but with an undertone of something I couldn't quite place, something cold and threatening. "There's a man outside the school right now, and he's armed. He's planning to come inside." My blood ran cold. I gripped the receiver so tightly my knuckles turned white. "What? What do you mean?" I stammered, my mind racing. "Who is this? Is this some kind of joke?" "This is not a joke," Mrs. Carter, the voice replied, still eerily calm. "I suggest you initiate a lockdown immediately if you want to keep your students safe." My heart was pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to hang up, to dismiss the call as a cruel prank, but something in the man's tone stopped me. There was a cold certainty in his voice, a lack of emotion that sent a wave of dread through me. "I'm going to call the office," I said, my voice trembling. "If this is real, we need to." "Don't waste time," the voice interrupted. "Do it now before it's too late." The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Was this real? Was there really someone outside the school with a gun? Or was it just a sick joke, some twisted prank designed to scare us? I didn't have time to think. I slammed the receiver down and turned to face my class. The students were still engrossed in their essays, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Everyone, put your pencils down," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "We're going into lockdown. Now." The students looked up at me, confused, some of them frowning in disbelief. Lockdowns were rare, and when they did happen, it was always just a drill, a practice run for a situation we all hoped would never come. "Now," I repeated, more forcefully this time. There was a moment of stunned silence before the students began to move, slowly at first, then with growing urgency as the reality of the situation set in. They pushed their desks to the side, crouching down behind them, their faces pale with fear. I quickly locked the door, turned off the lights, and pulled down the window shades, plunging the room into an eerie semi-darkness. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the students could hear it. I crouched down behind my desk, trying to keep my breathing steady, but the fear was overwhelming. My mind was racing, replaying the words the man on the phone had said, the cold, emotionless tone of his voice. Was this real? Was there really someone out there just waiting to come inside and do harm? I didn't know, but I couldn't take any chances. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The classroom was deathly quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of clothing as the students shifted nervously in their hiding spots. I could feel the tension in the room, the fear that hung thick in the air. My own fear was almost suffocating, a cold, paralyzing dread that seemed to seep into every corner of my being. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment, revealing some faceless, malevolent figure intent on causing harm. Every creak of the building, every distant sound, sent a jolt of terror through me. My mind was filled with horrible images, scenarios of what might happen if that door opened, if the man on the phone was telling the truth. The students were just as scared as I was. I could see it in their faces, in the way they huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Some of them were shaking, others were crying silently, their tears glistening in the dim light. I wanted to comfort them, to tell them that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. I couldn't lie to them, not when I didn't know what was going to happen. The lockdown stretched on, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. I kept expecting the intercom to crackle to life, for Principal Reynolds to announce that the lockdown was over, that it had all been a false alarm. But the intercom remained silent, and the fear continued to grow. At one point, there was a sound in the hallway, a faint, shuffling noise that sent a wave of panic through me. I tensed, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes locked on the door. The noise came again, closer this time, and I could see the students tense as well, their fear mirroring my own. The doorknob rattled and I felt my heart skip a beat. Someone was outside the door. My mind raced, torn between the instinct to protect my students and the overwhelming terror that paralyzed me, Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The doorknob stilled, and there was only silence. I waited, my heart pounding, for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. The intruder, if there had been one, was gone. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The fear, the uncertainty, the sense of impending doom, it was overwhelming. I kept replaying the phone call in my mind, the man's voice, the cold, emotionless tone. Was it real? Or was it just some cruel joke, some twisted prank meant to scare us? I didn't know. And that was the worst part, the not knowing. After what felt like an eternity, the intercom crackled to life. My heart leaped into my throat, and I held my breath, waiting for the announcement. "Attention, students and staff," Principal Reynolds' voice came over the intercom, sounding strained and weary. "The lockdown is now over. Please remain in your classrooms until further instructions are given. The situation has been resolved." The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. My legs felt weak, my hands trembling as I slowly stood up from behind my desk. I could see the students beginning to stir, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. The tension in the room seemed to lift, but the fear lingered, a shadow that would take time to fade. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The police arrived, and we were kept in the classroom while they conducted a thorough search of the school. We were eventually allowed to leave, but the atmosphere was heavy, the usual chatter and laughter of the students replaced with a tense silence. As I drove home that evening, the events of the day replayed in my mind over and over. The phone call, the lockdown, the fear, it was all too much to process. I kept thinking about the man on the phone, the cold, emotionless voice that had sent a wave of terror through me. Who was he? Was it a prank? Or was there really someone out there, someone who had intended to harm us? The answers never came. The police investigation turned up nothing. No sign of an intruder, no evidence that the threat had been real. The phone call was traced to a burner phone, untraceable and anonymous. It was as if the whole thing had been a bad dream, a nightmare that had left us all shaken and scared. In the days that followed, I found it hard to shake the fear that had gripped me during the lockdown. The school felt different, the sense of safety and security that I had always taken for granted shattered by that one phone call. I found myself jumpy, on edge, every little noise sending a jolt of panic through me. But life went on. The students returned to their routines, the school slowly returning to normal. But for me, and for many others, the events of that day left a lasting mark. It was a stark reminder of how fragile our sense of safety really is, how easily it can be shattered by a single, unexpected event. I continued teaching, continued dedicating myself to my students, but the fear lingered, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. And every time the phone rang in my classroom, I couldn't help but feel a shiver of dread, a reminder of that day, of the phone call that had changed everything. In the end, I learned a valuable lesson, one that I hope I never have to put to the test again. I learned that fear is a powerful thing, that it can grip you in ways you never thought possible. But I also learned that in the face of fear, we have to be strong, we have to protect those around us, even when we're scared ourselves. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, and the sun had just started to peek over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with trees, their leaves just beginning to change colors, signaling the early days of autumn. The crisp air carried the faint scent of pine, and the sky was a clear, cloudless blue. As I drove to school, my mind was occupied with the usual concerns, lesson plans, grading papers, and managing the various needs of my students. I've been a teacher at Maplewood Middle School for almost 10 years, and every day felt like a balancing act. My classroom was my sanctuary, a place where I felt both in control and deeply responsible for the well-being of the 30-some students who passed through my door each day. The school itself was a modest building, nestled between a large park and a cluster of residential homes. It was the kind of school where everyone knew each other, where parents volunteered at events and teachers went the extra mile to make sure every child felt included. The bell rang at 8 a.m. sharp, and by then the halls were filled with the bustling energy of students, their laughter and chatter echoing off the walls. My classroom was on the second floor, overlooking the playground and the parking lot. I always arrived early just after the janitors unlocked the doors to prepare for the day ahead. As I walked in that morning, the familiar smell of freshly polished floors and the faint scent of chalk greeted me. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner, and the desks were neatly arranged in rows, waiting for the students to fill them. I set my bag down on the desk and began going over my lesson plan for the day. It was a standard Tuesday with back-to-back classes and a faculty meeting during lunch. I had a quiz planned for my 8th grade history class on the American Revolution, and I was going over the questions one last time when the first students began to trickle in. The students were in good spirits as usual. They filed into the classroom, laughing and talking, some still groggy from having just woken up. I greeted them with a smile, watching as they took their seats and settled in for the day. Everything felt normal, routine even. It was just another day at Maplewood Middle School, or so I thought. Among my students was a boy named Ben. Ben was 13 years old, with sandy blonde hair that always seemed to be a little too long, falling into his eyes. He was one of those kids who seemed to blend into the background, neither particularly outgoing nor overly shy. Ben was quiet, reserved, and often lost in his own thoughts. He had a knack for history, which made him one of my favorite students, but he struggled with social interactions. Ben lived with his mom in a small 2-bedroom apartment not far from the school. His father had passed away when Ben was just 6 years old, leaving a void in his life that his mother did her best to fill. Mrs. Johnson was a kind woman, but she worked long hours to make ends meet, leaving Ben alone for much of the time. He spent most of his days after school at the library or at home, engrossed in books or video games. Despite his quiet nature, Ben had a close-knit group of friends. There was Jake, the class clown who could make anyone laugh, Sarah, who was fiercely intelligent and never hesitated to stand up for what she believed in, and Debra, the artistic one, always doodling in her notebook. Together, they formed a small but tight circle, often huddling together in the corner of the playground during recess, talking about everything from the latest superhero movies to the mysteries of the universe. Ben's fascination with history wasn't just limited to school. He was particularly interested in World War II, spending hours reading about battles, strategies, and the lives of those who lived through it. He often stayed after class to ask me questions, or to borrow books from my personal collection. I could see a spark in his eyes when we discussed historical events, a passion that he rarely showed in other areas of his life. But beneath his quiet exterior, Ben carried a weight that few people knew about. The loss of his father had left him with a deep-seated fear of abandonment, a fear that manifested in subtle ways. He was always the first to arrive in the morning, afraid of being late, and he hated surprises, preferring the predictability of routine. He was a good kid, one who tried his best to navigate the challenges life had thrown at him. But there was always a hint of sadness in his eyes, a reminder of the pain he carried with him. The day had started like any other, with the students settling into their seats and me going over the morning announcements. The first 2 periods passed without incident, and by the time we reached my third period history class, the school was in full swing. The students were engaged in a lively discussion about the causes of the American Revolution, debating the merits of taxation without representation and the influence of Enlightenment ideas on the colonists. I was in the middle of explaining the significance of the Boston Tea Party when the phone on my desk rang. It was an unusual occurrence during class time, and it immediately caught my attention. I excused myself from the discussion and picked up the receiver, expecting to hear the voice of the school secretary or perhaps another teacher. "Mrs. Smith," I answered, my tone polite but curious. There was a brief pause on the other end before a voice I didn't recognize spoke. "This is Officer McDonald from the Maplewood Police Department," the voice said, calm but with a sense of urgency. "We've received a report of a potential threat at the school. We need you to initiate a lockdown immediately." My heart skipped a beat, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. I had been through lockdown drills before, but never a real-life situation. The idea of a real threat was something I had never truly considered, something that seemed distant and unlikely. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "What kind of threat?" "We don't have all the details yet," Officer McDonald replied, his tone serious. "But we need to take every precaution. Please initiate the lockdown now and keep the students safe. We're on our way." The line went dead. For a moment I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, my mind racing. Was this really happening? Was there truly a threat, or was it some kind of misunderstanding? But I didn't have time to second-guess the situation. The safety of my students was my top priority, and I had to act quickly. I turned to face the class, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everyone, listen up," I said, my tone firm but calm. "We're going into lockdown. I need you to follow the procedures we've practiced. Move to the designated area, stay quiet, and do not leave your spot until I tell you it's safe." The students looked at me with wide eyes, a mix of confusion and fear on their faces. Lockdowns were a part of our routine, but this was different. They could sense the seriousness in my voice, the urgency that wasn't present during our drills. Slowly they began to move, pushing their desks to the side and gathering in the corner of the room, away from the windows and door. I locked the classroom door, turned off the lights, and pulled down the shades, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the small windows high up on the wall, casting long shadows across the room. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crouched down with the students, trying to maintain a calm exterior, even as my mind raced with fear and uncertainty. What if there really was a threat? What if someone was out there, intent on causing harm? The thought was terrifying, almost paralyzing. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint breathing of the students around me. I could see their faces in the dim light, the fear etched into their expressions. Ben was among them, his eyes wide with anxiety, his hands trembling slightly. I reached out and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze, trying to convey a sense of calm, even though I was anything but calm. We waited in silence, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. My mind kept going over the conversation with Officer McDonald, replaying his words, searching for some clue, some indication of what was happening. But there was nothing, just a growing sense of dread that gnawed at my insides. After what felt like forever and then some, the sound of sirens filled the air, faint at first but growing louder as they approached the school. The students stiffened, their fear palpable, and I could feel my own anxiety intensify. This was real. This wasn't a drill. Something was happening, something terrible. The sirens stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. My heart raced, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I couldn't see who was out there, but the sound of those footsteps sent a wave of terror through me. I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. The students were huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. I could feel the tension in the room, the fear that hummed thick in the air, suffocating us. But the door remained closed, and the footsteps faded away, leaving only the oppressive silence in their wake. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my body trembling with a mix of fear and relief. We stayed in lockdown for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a matter of minutes. Eventually, the sound of footsteps returned, lighter this time, followed by a soft knock on the door. "Mrs. Smith, it's Officer McDonald. You can come out now." I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust the voice. But then I stood up, my legs shaky, and slowly made my way to the door. I unlocked it and cracked it open, peeking out to see a uniformed officer standing there, his expression serious but calm. "It's safe," he said, his voice reassuring. "The threat has been neutralized." I nodded, my mind still reeling from the fear and uncertainty of the past few minutes. I turned back to the students, who were watching me with wide eyes, waiting for my next move. "It's over," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You can come out now." The students slowly began to stand, their movements hesitant, their fear still evident. They filed out of the room, one by one, their eyes darting around nervously as they made their way to the hallway. I followed them, my mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. The school was in chaos, with students and teachers alike milling about, talking in hushed tones, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. The police were everywhere, their presence a stark reminder of the seriousness of the situation. As we made our way to the gym, where the students were being gathered, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. The threat may have been neutralized, but the fear lingered, a shadow that hung over us all. The gym was filled with a low murmur of voices, a sharp contrast to the usual boisterous energy of the students. They sat in small groups, some huddled together for comfort, others sitting alone, staring off into the distance. The teachers moved among them, offering words of reassurance, but their own fear was evident in their tense expressions and hurried movements. I spotted Ben sitting near the bleachers, his knees pulled up to his chest, his face buried in his arms. He looked so small, so vulnerable, and my heart ached for him. I made my way over and sat down beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, Ben?" I asked softly. He lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with tears. "I was so scared," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought something bad was going to happen." I nodded, my own fear still fresh in my mind. "I know, Ben, we were all scared. But you were very brave. You did everything you were supposed to do, and that's what kept you safe." He sniffled and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I just want to go home," he said, his voice trembling. "We'll get you home soon," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure when that would be. The police were still conducting their investigation, and the school remained on high alert. But I could see the toll the ordeal had taken on Ben, and I wished I could do more to comfort him. The other students were in similar states, their fear and anxiety palpable. Some were crying, others sat in stunned silence, and a few were even angry, their emotions raw and unfiltered. The teachers did their best to comfort them, but it was clear that everyone was shaken by the events of the day. Principal Harris was at the front of the gym, speaking quietly with the police officers. His usually calm demeanor was replaced with a tense, worried expression, and I could see the strain of the situation in the lines on his face. He caught my eye and gave me a small, reassuring nod, though I could tell he was just as shaken as the rest of us. Eventually, the decision was made to send the students home for the day. The buses were brought around to the front of the school, and parents were notified to pick up their children as soon as possible. The students filed out of the gym in a slow, somber procession, their usual excitement at the prospect of an early dismissal replaced with a deep sense of unease. I stayed with Ben until his mother arrived, watching as he ran into her arms, his fear finally giving way to tears. Mrs. Johnson thanked me repeatedly, her own eyes filled with worry and relief. I assured her that Ben had been brave, that he had done everything right, but I could see the fear lingering in her expression, the same fear that had taken hold of all of us. As the last of the students left, the teachers gathered in the faculty lounge, their usual camaraderie replaced with a heavy silence. The events of the day had left us all rattled, and the reality of how close we had come to a potential tragedy was sinking in. Mrs. Martin, one of the veteran teachers, sat down heavily in a chair, her hands trembling. "I've been teaching for 30 years, she said quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief, "and I've never been so scared in my life." There were murmurs of agreement from the others, and I could see the exhaustion in their faces, the toll that the fear had taken on all of us. Principal Harris entered the room, his expression somber. "I want to thank all of you for your quick response today," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You kept the students safe, and that's what matters most. The police have assured me that the threat has been neutralized, but we'll be conducting a thorough review of our procedures to ensure that we're prepared for any future incidents." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in the weary faces of his staff. "I know this was a difficult day," he continued, "but I want you all to take some time to rest and recover. We'll regroup tomorrow and discuss how we move forward from here." There were nods of agreement, but the exhaustion was evident in everyone's eyes. The events of the day had left a deep impression on all of us, and it was clear that it would take time to fully process what had happened. The drive home that evening was a blur, my mind replaying the events of the day over and over. The fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming sense of responsibility for the safety of my students, it all weighed heavily on me. I had always prided myself on being a calm and collected teacher, someone who could handle any situation with grace and confidence. But today had shaken me in a way I hadn't expected. As I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat in the car for a moment, taking deep breaths to steady myself. The quiet of the evening felt almost surreal after the chaos of the day, and I found myself feeling a strange disconnect, as if the events at the school had happened in a different world entirely. When I finally walked into my house, the familiar surroundings offered little comfort. The fear I had felt during the lockdown lingered, a gnawing anxiety that I couldn't shake. I found myself double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, something I had never been particularly concerned about before. The sense of safety I had always taken for granted was suddenly gone, replaced by a deep-seated unease. That night I struggled to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened. The sound of the phone ringing in my classroom kept echoing in my head, followed by the ominous voice of Officer McDonald. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent a jolt of fear through me, and I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. Over the next few days, the school tried to return to normal, but the events of that Tuesday had left a lasting impact on everyone. The students were quieter, more subdued, and there was a noticeable tension in the air. The usual laughter and chatter in the hallways were replaced with hushed conversations and nervous glances. The teachers, too, were affected. There was a lingering sense of fear, a feeling of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. We had all been through lockdown drills before, but this was different. The reality of a potential threat had shattered the illusion of safety we had all taken for granted. For Ben, the impact was especially profound. He became more withdrawn, his usual quiet demeanor now tinged with a nervousness that hadn't been there before. He no longer stayed after class to talk about history, and I noticed that he seemed more anxious, more on edge. I tried to reach out to him, to offer support, but I could see that the fear had taken hold of him, just as it had with so many others. The false alarm, though it had turned out to be just that, a false alarm, had left a scar, a reminder of how quickly things could change, how easily our sense of security could be shattered. As the weeks went by, the fear began to fade, but it never fully disappeared. The school returned to its routine, the students slowly regained their energy, and the teachers tried to move on. But there was always a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that we were never truly safe, that the events of that day could happen again at any time.